James Corbett has been around, I don't know, 5-6 years, has a great TV show he does, and he does stuff for Global Research as well, and he's a frequent guest here on air with us, and he joins us for the rest of the hour. James, with all the things happening in the world right now, before I get to all my questions, what is front and center on your radar screen right now?
Well, obviously here in Japan, where it seems to be a bright and sunshiny day over here, but that just belies the fact that 700 kilometers from where I am, unfortunately, Fukushima is continuing to act up and to do strange things that can't be accounted for yet. So I definitely want to get into that. But before I do, let me just say thank you for having me on today, and thank you for letting me be a part of this. And I'd like to put the call out for any Corbett Report supporters out there in the audience. I'd like to challenge them to do exactly what I've just done, which is donate to the InfoWars Money Bomb, because I've said it before and I'll say it again. There would be no Corbett Report without the Alex Jones Show, without Infowars.com, without PrisonPlanet.tv, without all of the incredible information that you've been putting out for decades now. There just wouldn't be a Corbett Report, because the information can come from many sources, but the message, the core heart and kernel of Infowars, which is that people can get out there and take action into their own hands and to put this information into other people's hands, that was what motivated me to start the Corbett Report in the first place. So my hat's off to you for all your incredible work over the years, and I hope that people out there will support the InfoWars project.
Well, James, thank you. That's always been my mission, is to get researchers and thinkers and people like yourself to take action and get involved. That's where we have true safety, is in numbers and people like yourself taking action. I want to get into what's happening in Greece, Iran, Libya, all the things you've been covering, the fake bin Laden killing, this man of peace, this Peace Prize winner Obama, and all of his wars. But before we get into that, let's talk about Fukushima. You know, we go back 6-8 months ago, the explosions, the radiation, the EPA raising the level of what's safe, the whole government of Japan having to basically resign, the leaders over a cover-up, and now we're told fission is continuing in the last week. The black belching death of radiation is continuing to leak out on the people of Japan, then across the Pacific, wreaking havoc into North America.
Exactly right. And let's go through the last week, because there's been some pretty big things happening, especially because they've been trying to tell us for a while now that everything's under control, go back to sleep, no need to look at this or worry about it. Everything's going into cold shutdown. It'll be done even earlier than expected, so there's nothing to worry about anymore. And that's the message that's been going out through TEPCO and the Japanese government and the mainstream media. But some very worrying signs cropped up this week that that's definitely not the case. And for people who are interested in this, there are really very few sites on the net that are devoted to this issue. There are a few really good ones out there. But I decided to create my own website, FukushimaUpdate.com, where I'm going through hundreds of articles every day and trying to highlight the best ones on the situations. And there's just so few websites out there that are really doing that. So I hope more people will take that up and start spreading this information. But let's go through this week. On Wednesday morning at about 2:30 a.m. Japanese time, the TEPCO had detected some high levels of xenon-135, which is a byproduct of nuclear fission. So they were very concerned about that. And they started pumping boric acid into the reactor 2, the molten slag heap that is reactor 2 at this point. And in order to try to contain that reaction, that fission that they had detected, although they didn't detect it directly, they detected it through the xenon-135. They did that in 2:30 in the morning on Wednesday, and then they came out that day and said, well, yes, it seems that recriticality has been achieved. That is, the molten slag heap in the bottom of the reactor there has somehow, amazingly, actually started spontaneous fission again, which shouldn't be able to happen because it requires the fuel to be packed in the right way with the right water in the right way, and everything happening should be the case that it has to be a certain special series of events that have to take place for criticality to be achieved.
Well, just to interrupt, you know, my dad only took one semester of physics at UT, but they have a nuclear reactor there back in the 60s, and physicists have had on, and Dr. Busby and others, they say that naturally, through electrolysis or whatever, that these systems kind of percolate into layers, and that naturally it can purify into levels to create this fission. And regardless, they've now admitted this is now happening.
Well, they came out and admitted it later on that day, but the latest, the very latest from NHK is that TEPCO retracts criticality call, and they're basically saying that no, our mistake. The Xenon 135 doesn't mean that a continuing reaction has occurred. It means that there's been spontaneous nuclear fission of radioactive curium-242 and 244, and it's just spontaneous fission. It's not a big deal. It's not an ongoing concern, and I think the overwhelming message of this is, once again, go back to sleep. It's not such a big deal. And one of the interesting things that slipped out when they were admitting that they had detected this fission going on in 2 is that they were also detecting other things going on in 1 and 3, and they weren't ruling out the idea that 1 and 3 were achieving recriticality as well. So that's really worrying. Right now, they're saying it's not a sign of criticality, but there are some other worrying indications that are coming out right now, including this one: reactor 2 hydrogen levels rising despite work to improve reliability of nitrogen injection. And then there's another really important story about Xenon not Xenon 135. That was the one that originally prompted them to start investigating this. But there was a 100-fold increase in Krypton 95, if I'm reading that correctly. 100-fold increase on November 2nd, which is a different byproduct, and Krypton 85, and it points to, again, this hasn't been explained from what I understand from their latest retraction of the criticality call. They're talking about Xenon 135. Oh, that was the spontaneous fission of this curium, but they haven't talked yet about the Krypton 85, which you can go and you can look at TEPCO's reports because they're releasing all these details, very detailed analyses of what they're finding, and you can see that on their reports, but they're not talking about the Krypton 85. And then there's another video that came out the other day. Informable picked up on this. Just incredible. It looks like there's a new hole in the containment for Unit 2. It hasn't been verified yet, and I don't see anyone else reporting on it, but if you go and look at the video, there's definitely something there that wasn't there the other day. So the implication is that there might have been another explosion. There might have been something, I don't know, forcing its way out of there. We don't know at this point, but Informable also managed to capture some video of the crane doing some testing right outside where that hole is. So that raises the possibility that maybe that's where they're doing the testing that they found the Xenon 135, and who knows if this is related to something much, much bigger going on right there that we don't know about. And that's the point, because what we've seen with this whole disaster is they keep not telling us about critical things until months later. Oh yeah, by the way, we detected meltdown in the first few hours of the disaster. I mean, just ridiculous things like that.
Well, that was my next point, is that if you go back to when all this started, we saw mushroom clouds, huge explosions, reactor cores injected into the sky, and months later they said, yeah, the Japanese government covered it up with bulldozers and didn't even mark where they covered the rods. A mile and a half away. It's so important, and you were on air covering that, and I remember your coverage of that in the first few days, and you were looking at the explosion, and you were noting, well, that looks like there are rods going out, and all of that sort of stuff, and that did come out later, and they just kind of blithely buried it in some New York Times stories.
All
I did was go up and look at the General Electric designs, and then say that, but it did turn out that was true. But it turns out they knew it the whole time and lied to people. But in Japan, a lot of the government's gotten in trouble. Here, as the smog drifts over, and the trade winds and the jet stream over to North America, it's just, hey, it's fine, go to sleep.
Yeah, well, I think there are two interesting things to take out of the whole Fukushima debacle, and one of them is the fact that I'm sure your listeners don't need to be told this, but here it is again, triple confirmed, that anytime there's a threat to the system itself, to the functioning of the big corporations that are in bed with the big government or the overarching system, whenever there's a threat to that, they will rally around themselves to protect themselves, and they don't care at all about the average person. And that came out when the Prime Minister, who was the Prime Minister during this crisis, Naoto Kan, when he left office, he did some interviews, and he said, oh, by the way, guess what? When I was Prime Minister in the wake of this crisis, and I was asking my advisors, what is the worst thing that can happen? Like, in worst case scenario, what should we do? What'll happen? And they were saying, you're going to have to evacuate Tokyo. And he said he ruled it out immediately because that would call into question the viability of Japan as a nation.
Well, let me raise that.
That's the point.
Let me raise that point, because I forgot the percentage of folks that live in Tokyo for overall Japan.
I think it's 30 million in the greater metropolitan area out of, 125 million, something like that.
So you're talking about 25%.
it's in that range, yeah.
Yeah. So, but I've seen documentaries now, and people pointing out that an American tourist that just 2 years ago or a year ago, you'd go and the subways were jammed, the streets were jammed. Now I've seen videos where it's like a ghost town in many cases. Are you seeing that living in Japan, that the Japanese have evacuated to the south or the west?
I'm seeing the exact opposite in a lot of ways. I would expect it to be a lot different, but it seems that it's not that way. And I personally, I've still never even been to that part of the country. I've never even been in that area, so I don't know from firsthand. But I've seen, for example, on Zero Hedge yesterday, they had some coverage of a guy who went to Fukushima and basically taking pictures of the town, just everyone, going about their business, and everything just seemed like normal. And I think that's been the way that the Japanese have been coping with this to a certain extent, on a certain surface level. The old Japanese mentality of just gut up and take it, and that's one of the reactions. But I think there's an underlying reaction that's going on here that suggests something completely different. Because NHK is also reporting today 70% in Japan want end to nuclear power, and that shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, because of course Japan, the Japanese, have an aversion to nuclear power and have had for a long time. Obviously, given the history of Hiroshima and all of that. But I think what this indicates is that finally people are starting to speak up about it, and you're starting to see movements of people and organizations and protests of nuclear power that are growing, and I think becoming a bigger force in Japan. And that's something that I'm not sure would have happened if it wasn't for something like Fukushima. So I think there is some sort of countervailing tendency. The public is waking up. The public are questioning what they're being told, and that's a very hopeful sign for a society like Japan. But is it enough?
Well, it certainly is a hopeful thing, because they're trying to build more of these nuclear power plants. And I'm not against technology, but you had in the 50s
exactly
a plant
right.
blow
Well,
up.
the thing is, they can construct nuclear power plants in a safer way. But the reason that we use the uranium, the reason it's been constructed like this, is because of the nuclear weapons industry, and it's really a byproduct of that. Is the reason we have the construction that we have today, which is inherently unsafe and is going to cause more disasters like this in the future.
Well, you're right about that, and so they won't let us have all these clean technologies or cleaner. We've got all this 40-year-old designs. You had Simi Valley reactor blow up in the 50s. They covered that up. We've had all these other reactor disasters, and there's just this establishment belief that if they're just delusional and say it's all fine, that makes it okay.
It's not only that. I mean, if you look in the way that the reaction to this played out, even in Japan, let alone in America and in Canada and all around the world, but in Japan, of course, in the immediate wake of the disaster, they raised the maximum radiation levels for the nuclear power plant workers to 250 millisieverts from 100, and they've just put it back down to 100. So it just goes to show that these figures that they give the public are just as meaningless as they make it. I mean, it's not worth the paper it's not written on, basically, that they can just adjust these numbers anytime they like, and it is truly just to preserve the functioning of the state and preserve the functioning of the company and make sure that they can't get sued in the future. It has nothing to do with public safety. The exact same thing with the maximum allowable radiation limits in food, which they bumped up in the wake of the disaster to 500 millisieverts or 500 becquerels per kilogram, which they've just once again brought down to put it in line with international standards. But again, it shows you they just put it up and down whatever they need in order to cover their hind ends and make sure that they're safe and sound, and that nothing will be able to challenge their monopolies of power.
Well, we're talking to James Corbett of the Corbett Report. James, getting into other issues, you've covered Libya, you've covered what's happening right now in the Euro, you've covered Israel openly saying they're getting ready to strike Iran 3 weeks after we first started reporting on it. Geopolitically, what do you see as the biggest threat on the horizon?
I'm really concerned about the way the Syria and Iran talk is ramping up again after they seem to be distracted with the whole Libyan campaign. But of course, after they got rid of Gaddafi, it's just what's the next one on the list? And it looks like it's going to be Syria if things unfold as they're unfolding. And we see that we see so many parallels between the campaign to demonize Syria right now and the campaign that was used to demonize Libya, and even the campaign that was used against Hussein back in '91. So, for example, back in January of this year, the Human Rights Council was holding meetings and considering whether to give Libya a human rights award for all of their great work in educating their population and having relative freedom in their society. Literally in January, they were talking about that. And then in February, this bunch of NGOs came together to write this letter protesting what. And 3 days after they wrote that letter to the UN, the Human Rights Council convened a special session in which they condemned Libya. They condemned Gaddafi. They wanted him out of the Human Rights Council. They wanted Security Council to take over. And of course, that started the whole ball rolling that led to the no-fly zone, which turned into a bombing campaign overnight. However, that happened.
Peace action. I mean, a Peace Prize winner led it, though, so it's liberal. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the liberal love a little girl with her jaw blown off with her tongue hanging out, screaming in pain. I mean, that's trendy, James.